Okay, well, this is exciting. A new false narrative just dropped. And while they are always snatched up like hotcakes, considering the cold, hard, desolate, hostile, vertical place the Lynch squad find themselves in, this one is particularly welcome. That's due to the gravitas, the incredible calibre of the author, the analytical and highly qualified to comment, Christopher Sutcliffe, Snowden. And this is a man adept at using his own animal magnetism to get what he wants. He is entirely aware of what he's doing here. And it's obviously furnished him very well because he has this dazzling career. But what is it that he's doing with his eyes? Maybe we should ask Tyra. Let's see if she's about.
A smize.
Oh, I see. Okay, go on.
A fierce, intense eye expression. Typically done with the eyes squinting, with maximum focus and intensity. Otherwise known as smiling with the eyes. A smize gets you what you want.
Now, in a world without consequence, my goodness, I would be travelling to his home and waiting on his doorstep to find out what it is he really wants. But on this occasion, I've decided to exercise some restraint and look away, at the very least, while he's channeling fearless, rare, raw, damn rugged, confident and experienced masculinity. For health and safety reasons, because we do live in a nanny state, something he cares about, he's had to rein it in a little bit. And so you look at later photographs and you'll see he's toned it down a little. But I think even looking at this, you know, if smizing was a crime, he'd be locked up for life. Dear God, look at him. Oh, you little minx. Anyway, I know this is not serious commentary and it is maybe out of order, but he deserves it. The way he behaves towards people online is just gross, and he is quite a buffoonish character whose stock seems to be in absolute certainty rather than correctness. Strong Dunning-Kruger vibes. He seems to me to be the type of guy who harumphs and refuses to get up for a pregnant woman on the tube, which he then defends, as in he has taught her an important lesson in life that she should take responsibility for her actions. So, as I say, he's brash, he's condescending, he's very quick to resort to ad hominem attack. He doesn't seem to show the subject as much seriousness as it deserves. It just feels like really petty tribalism. He's extraordinarily delicate and fragile. He remembers that Matt Letizia blocked him 4 years ago, while he himself often replies very sarcastically and aggressively to people from behind a block, often which is put in place before he's ever interacted with them. And then his host of articles and talking head parts where he talks about Lucy Letby making the same nonsense points over and over again, which obviously if you try to correct him, he will block you. Where is his relevance in discussing this? This man is a lifestyle economist. He's not a doctor. He's not an expert in the law. And he continually wavers between, well, she's definitely guilty because of this, and then, but it can't get through the Court of Appeal. So he's making comments on the legal validity of whatever claims. This has recently got into slurring Dr. Shuley, which is hilarious, reasserting his severe Dunning-Kruger affliction and general pomposity. He's just, despite this robust-looking, slightly porcine skin, he is remarkably delicate and somewhat kind of musty. You just get a musty sense from him. Or that clothes moths may be flying out from his every orifice if he moves too fast. Or that he is drenched in brute or something like that, while also complaining that his McDonald's apple slice thing is dangerously hot. A weapon, in fact. He's not a serious commenter, but he has created the new false narrative, which finally I'll get to. And that is, despite treating this entire case as a game of one-upsmanship, being the very po-faced, pearl-clutching, oh my God, just one page a baby, riposte, which has been repeated. And this is, of course, referencing the international expert panel headed by Shuley. And this is apparently a problem, even though, as has been pointed out time and time and time again, that it's a summary. But still, one page each. It's disrespectful. Posting AI pictures of Lucy Letby isn't disrespectful or aggravating to the loved ones of these babies, apparently. And then there's the fact that under his posts, quite often the abuse gets really bad. You don't see him calling it out, and you don't see these people saying they've been blocked. And some of it is also just extraordinarily tasteless when we're talking about babies. As I've said many times, this is a serious problem with this group of people, but it doesn't seem to be something that concerns him. He doesn't seem to be blocking or removing them. Then also, he just pushes narratives and stories and arguments that have been entirely debunked. He may block the people who point this out, but he's obviously seen it to block them, so that's dishonest. It's fundamentally dishonest. At the moment, his aim seems to be to discredit Shuley and the other experts of this panel. And that centres around the idea that if, for example, you are Shuley and you find out that this woman has been locked up for the rest of her life, partly based on your paper, is one of very few of its kind, and you realise that the descriptions don't fit, so that makes you biased. And this, your intricate knowledge of things that were discussed in court, means that you are not a reliable witness. That is genuinely the argument. By identifying that nonsense said in court was nonsense, he's proven himself to be a Letbyist, even though your paper was cited 29 times by the prosecution. You have no standing here. Identifying it as wrong and wanting to correct it means you are biased. Therefore, you should have nothing to do with it. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to... Jesus Christ, this has been such a mess. Been so many things I could pick apart if I had the time or energy. Now, I was not always aware of who Christopher Snowden was. Not until recently. And let me tell you, it's an embarrassing admission to make, but it was only when he popped up discussing this case on his Substack. A piece that was unforgivably recommended to me by some flailing twat spanner. Wish Snowden had preemptively blocked me and I had never seen this. I would be far more comfortable in my day-to-day life. I wish I had time to go through his more recent articles. They're all rubbish. I don't have that time. Anyway, so he does recommend that people correct him if he gets anything wrong, but then you do get blocked for that. I can't remember actually whether I was blocked on Substack, but I made a couple of really polite because I'd already seen his Twitter behaviour, and he didn't reply, but he was very insulting to a couple of others. Strange. He's relatively good with the insults, but you also get the feeling he was born middle-aged, a bit of a Gary Barlow. He has chosen an image drawn by a court artist where Lucy Letby, after the conviction for attempted murder of child K, turned to Judge Goss and said, "I am not guilty of that which I have been convicted." Out from his trap springs Snowden, saying, "If I err in what I say below, feel free to let me know in comments." Well, yes, he didn't respond too well to that, but anyway, with an Evans-esque confidence, he felt armed with the truth, and here is one of his first paragraphs. This is at least honest. Quote, "I should say from the off that I was not present at the trial and I have not read the court transcripts." Well, let's stop you there for a second, my dear. At this stage, well, there wouldn't have been transcripts for child K, but yeah. The transcripts have been widely spoken about as having costed astronomical amounts. David Davis confirmed what Peter Elston and several other people had said, that they had initially been quoted £100,000, which is why some of us are a little bit suspect as to whether crime scene to courtroom actually paid that much. I mean, maybe all of his followers chucked in like 98 pence each. Is possible. It just doesn't reflect very well on him, and especially when you have rabid fans of Crime Scene to Courtroom really advocating and, suggesting his channel to everyone, then filling freedom of information requests with questions as to whether the New Yorker is lying. And I mean, all of the recommendations for his channel, as if it is the font of truth. It's a little concerning, actually. But whatever, the fact he has said he has them has given people incredible confidence. And I suspect probably he's brought up a little bit of the prosecution's cross-examination and a tiny fraction of the defence. And that's it. But he's welcome to prove me wrong. Anyway, as you can see, Christopher Snowden was very quick to cite Crime Scene to Courtroom as a reliable source of information. And this is where it gets a bit worrying, because he really is taken as gospel. So I should say from the off that I was not present at the trial and I've not read the court transcripts. At least that is honest, all right? But the next bit's a bit troubling. So our darling Chris goes on. I don't pretend to know every detail of the case, and I am not going to go down a rabbit hole for the sake of a convicted child murderer. This is a bit of a problem, isn't it? Isn't it? Like, Jesus Christ. You're not going to bother looking into it because you've already decided she's a child murderer. But yes, please go on. Who has time for that nonsense, eh? I disagree with Peter Hitchens on an awful lot of things, and it's only this that's made me consider just rethinking him at all. Because some of his views I find really repellent or just regressive and dumb. But he has spoken about how he was so angry after the terrorist atrocities in Guildford and Birmingham that he just would not listen to the appeals of innocence, and that has taught him an awful lot. I suspect it's probably a lot better listening to somebody who admits to learning from a mistake, and that's where you find little bits of wisdom along the way. But if anyone has been piously dogmatic in holding a view, it's been Christopher Snowden, with this idiotic stance. And that, I mean, it often includes, like the rest of them, deciding that defending a woman up against obviously fallacious charges of child murder is defending mass child murder. That's his brilliant logic. And I think we're meant to listen to him because he's someone in the Institute of Economic Affairs, which makes him, a scientific kind of guy. He has obviously been taken over, well, you could say with emotion, and it's possible that is it. But I think it's more likely he finds a role for himself as a leader for the ragtag cohort who believe they are really telling the truth and really fighting misinformation. Anyway, so finally, Jesus Christ, I'm rambling, on to his article. Now, yes, he cites Peter Sutcliffe and Harold Shipman and Beverly Allitt, but I refuse to misrepresent him, and he does state later on Sutcliffe was found with a hammer, which was obviously his murder weapon, and that Harold Shipman was an opioid addict. But he doesn't go on to explain that Peter Sutcliffe's wife had all sorts of anecdotal evidence as to his misogynistic violence, or the work-related and geographical evidence that tied him to many different scenes of crimes over and over again. Snowden forgets to mention that Sutcliffe had been interviewed by the police 9 times due to his proximity to the offences. And rather bizarrely claims that the only thing that was touted by psychologists was that he was a mummy's boy. I have no idea what he's read that makes him believe this, as well as perpetrating domestic violence against his wife. As a child, Peter Sutcliffe was unfortunate enough to witness domestic violence. And saying this, I in no way wish to smear all little boys who witness this trauma. But very sadly, in this instance, it does appear to have been highly relevant. Then, while on remand, during his trial, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. In fact, I think it was paranoid schizophrenia with florid hallucinations. Again, the vast majority of schizophrenics are not a danger to other people, but when you look back, when somebody's being convicted of crimes like this, you would expect to see some of these threads running throughout their lives, and when there are none, it may be worth questioning it, because there tends to be some historical symbolism to the crimes, or it's underlined by madness or hate. The mistake Snowden makes with Harold Shipman is that he is just so uninquisitive and lazy. Harold Shipman, as he correctly says, was a long-standing abuser of opiates, and he had been addicted. But this has deeper roots. Harold Shipman's mother was dying of cancer while he was just around the time he was reaching his mid to late teens. His mother was apparently very dominant and controlling of him, which we have no idea the resentment that underpinned his relationship with her. So this was the 60s, she was in agony at home, dying, waiting for the doctor to come round and administer some opiate relief. And at some point, because of the sparsity of home visits and, well, I guess just that, he began to take over her care. I had a friend who died late last year, and he had become addicted to opiates during his teens as his mother was dying of cancer at home, meaning the opiates were available, and he also developed schizophrenia. It's obviously an enormous, unspeakable trauma, but as I say, his mother was allegedly close to abusive with her controlling and domineering ways. And I do wonder how much he felt that he was coming into his own, reaching the age of majority, and that he was now able to step into a godlike role and shut her up, especially when it's something she's going to be thanking him for. It's very interesting, because obviously his victims were older women, quite likely around the age his mother would have been if she had survived. He was reportedly absolutely devastated by her death and ran through the streets of Nottingham, I think it was, in floods of tears like a little boy. I do wonder if he had had some part to play in her demise, but that may be too cynical of me. Or, yeah, I mean, that perhaps he felt that it was euthanasia and then regretted it. Very shortly after her death, he met his wife-to-be and got her pregnant, and they married while she was fairly heavily pregnant, I think, in the late 60s. At least Primrose, his wife, stood by him. The family did change their surname afterwards. And that's not something we have seen with the Letbys, as far as I'm aware, although maybe that's a moot point with them being the parent. Anyhow, by the mid-70s, he was a GP. He was young, he had 4 or 5 kids, and was working as a GP when he was fired for either fraud or forgery of prescriptions, which he had written out for pethidine. He had to go into drug rehabilitation. I'm not entirely sure what that constituted, but I mean, it's a bit of a maverick move. Probably one, though, that would be irresistible to an addict with the ability to write a prescription. After some time, he set up his surgery near Manchester and began slowly a murder campaign. And as I said, famously, the majority of the victims were elderly ladies. As a healthcare serial killer, of course he will be invoked in this conversation around Lucy Letby, but particularly because apparently his patients were very fond of him. Although the party line at the moment is actually that everyone thought Lucy Letby was odd, but there's some significant differences. First among these is he tended to be alone with his victims. He wasn't in a very small, crowded room with lots of other people. He had been with his victims almost always alone, imminently before or as they died. They often died in their own home or sometimes in his surgery. And these were people living in the community. They weren't in an intensive care unit. But let it not be said he didn't occasionally mix it up a bit. One of his earliest murders, it is believed, was of a relatively young man with health problems, although nothing that meant he was liable to die soon. This man was not expected to die. His wife was also there, and obviously you have adults in this scenario, so people have generally maybe a better guess at how unwell or well they are. He visited the home of this middle-aged, I suppose like 40, late 30s, 40-something man, and said he needed to give him an injection. And he tried to force the man's wife to hold the syringe as this struggling man. Oh, it's a horrible, horrible story. But as the man was not okay with this. Of course, he was using intravenous injections to deliver fatal amounts of opiates, which leave a more significant bruise than intramuscular injections do. So the wife fled the room. Then she came back up and she saw Shipman throttling her husband. She had obviously asked what on earth was going on, and he said it was to stop him from swallowing his tongue. But it clearly wasn't that convincing to her. He then made some statements that, he may well be dead in a few minutes or something along those lines. It seemed a little bit contradictory with putting him through the distress of holding him in this way. And obviously an enormous shock. And this was a man who could verbalise and express himself. He wasn't that ill. So on hearing that her husband was about to die, she said she was going to call for an ambulance, which Shipman said he would do it. So she got the phone, which should have been obviously on a wire back then. She dials 999 and hands the phone over to Shipman while she goes to her husband, probably in different rooms. And he hung up. This is something he did several times. And back then, people would get a full paper printout of their phone's activity over the last month with their bill. So it became obvious. And there are many more material examples. So his supposed reliving of releasing his mother from this pain. This story, and there's loads of other details, make it fairly obvious this was not about euthanasia. A very, good example, a horrifying story, is that of Kathleen Grundy. He had been called out to Kathleen's to do a blood test. Although she was very elderly, she was in really good health and very active. And the overriding hint is that maybe he resented being called out of work to do home visits. And I do wonder if he perceived this as a trivial waste of his time, since she was very active, or whether it was just the action of drawing back blood from a vein that did it. And as a former opiate addict, I can definitely say there's something really very visceral and exciting about the whole process. There's no way I'd be able to deal with this in my working life, even after 10 years of abstinence. It's just too triggering. And that, combined with Kathleen's wealth, may have just made it too much to resist. I do wonder if that triggered real anger. Ultimately, this all seems underpinned by probably a resentment towards his mother. To me, this was not altruistic. These people didn't want to die. They weren't in great pain. So Shipman comes round to do a home visit and take some blood, and that's the last person she saw. Within 3 hours, she's found in her chair, dead. And shortly after that, unbelievably, Shipman turns up to retrieve any opiates that have been left in the home, which is probably him going back to tidy up the scene. For example, one thing that was noticed was that a lot of his patients had died sitting up in a chair, sometimes even with their sleeves pulled up, as if they'd just had some blood taken. After her death, Shipman spoke to Kathleen's daughter, who was told not to worry about an inquest or pathology. And weirdly, he also advised that she be cremated. She wasn't. She was buried, which is important. Kathleen's daughter finds out that her mother's entire estate has been left to Shipman, which obviously doesn't make very much sense. So they look at the signature, and the signature doesn't look quite right. So they start to look at the paper, and the police start to get involved. And it would emerge that all over this paper is Harold Shipman's fingerprints. And not only that, but there's a peculiarity in the way the will has been typed up. Typewriters back then, you see. And they investigate this peculiarity and notice enough that would pinpoint the particular typewriter it was made on, which happened to belong to Harold Shipman and be in his house. And it all begins to fall into place. Kathleen's body is exhumed, along with many others, all of those who were buried, as far as I'm aware. And would you guess it, they had sky-high levels of opiates. So there you have definite forensic proof of foul play, yeah? Then it emerges that a pharmacist has long been concerned about the amount of opiates that have been prescribed and given out by Shipman. And it also emerges that the coroner has been very concerned about the number of deaths in strange places like his GP surgery. So it's quite different, really, isn't it? And I don't think putting it down to Shipman having had a substance abuse problem really cuts it, Chris. Although undoubtedly it points to a troubled mental state. Now, the favourite comparator, which is Beverly Allitt. It is true that Beverly Allitt was broadly liked in her community. It doesn't appear that there's any outrageous instances of abuse or neglect in her background, or any kind of shocking stories of sadism, particularly early on, but that's not the whole story. Chris rightly points out that it would appear that she has Munchausen's by proxy, or Munchausen's. That is absolutely established, I would say. She often appeared at school with splints or braces or bandages that she never gave a convincing explanation for. And this evolved into something that they referred to as doctor hopping. So she would change surgeries because the doctors would wise up to her endless hypochondria. This appears to have taken over her life. She was constantly off of work and training later on when she wanted to become a nurse, to the extent that she could never even get close to fulfilling her workload for any qualifications whatsoever. Allegedly, she had a healthy appendix removed after turning up in squealing pain at A&E. They found absolutely nothing wrong with this appendix on dissection. And then once that had been performed, she kept picking at the sutures. She kept aggravating the scar to cause infection or a bigger scar or whatever, to get an appointment with the doctor. And it wasn't, a casual, I've hurt my back kind of thing. It would be, I've been run over by a bicycle, I've been kicked by a horse. It's always an elaborate story to accompany her injuries. It's just they were so outlandish and unconvincing, it stuck in people's heads, and the frequency was constant. She was apparently violent to her boyfriend, often kneeing him in the groin, almost necessitating, potentially, a doctor's visit himself. And she had apparently lied. I mean, I'm fully prepared to believe it was a lie, but apparently lied that she had been raped by a previous boyfriend, even though nobody had known her to have a previous boyfriend. She was wildly demanding and controlling over little details, over whether she would hold her boyfriend's hand in public, what he had to do for her to have sex, which was only once a month, demanding that he buy her an engagement ring before anything had really happened between them, and he sadly fell into that. Doesn't sound like she was interested in men at all, actually, and I do wonder if she just needed somebody to control. She told a new female friend that she appeared quite infatuated with that her boyfriend had AIDS, which wasn't true. And in this being the very early 90s, that would have been even more kind of shocking than it might be today. If we were going to be kind and charitable to Beverly, which I don't know why we should be, she was a bit of a raconteur, let's put it that way. She had stories about a poltergeist which plunged a carving knife into her pillow, tried to drug her landlady's dog, set curtains on fire. I mean, all sorts was going on with poor Bev. And this begins to reach a crescendo with the feces in the fridge debacle. There's also accusations that she smeared human feces over the walls in an old people's home she was working at. And as I mentioned recently, very much like Virginia McCulloch, she was antisocial and everyone had a story about her, as well as her faking pregnancies. Due to her massive rate of illnesses during training, she never qualified, as I say. And her colleagues, rather than getting on with her or maybe just disliking her, they thought that she needed psychiatric help. So all in all, I'm not convinced that these are comparable cases, Chris. Yeah. I think there are a host of other fairly significant issues which you just don't see with Lucy Letby. You just don't see a single one of them. In fact, part of what makes this so terrifying to me is Lucy Letby's entirely blameless, squeaky clean life. Nobody can counter that. The best they have is she failed a placement for bad bedside manner. Christopher goes on to mindlessly parrot the line that she was there at every suspicious collapse and death. He reasserted this in a debate with David Davies on Spectator TV yesterday. He had his arse swiftly handed back, but hasn't acknowledged that. I would love to know why we haven't been given a definition on what a suspicious collapse entails. Claims that she has changed hospital records is... The entire premise is that she's a liar, so she's lying about everything. That's it. In one case, the time was corroborated by the mother, who said she had turned up at 9, whereas Lucy Letby said it was 10. And the time discrepancy of an hour is important. So the mother corroborated her time by getting the phone records, because she called her husband afterwards. It said 9. We were in British summertime, whereas phone companies don't use this. Idea that she was somehow stalking parents by searching for people generally thousands of times, and for the parents 31 times in all. That's all. The post-it notes have been debunked, and you may think, since this came out last summer, that he has recanted some of this. Well, he has not, no. The I killed them on purpose nonsense is something that's been neglected, but I will just briefly touch on it now. Firstly, let's remind ourselves what had happened up to that point when she wrote them. So she had been present at a series of deaths which, to everyone around her, had clearly deeply impacted her. Here is what one mother, the mother of the triplets, said at the death of her second child. She is not the only mother to say this, and looking at her text messages as well as what people around her at the time said, this had really impacted her. She then discovers that the consultants are calling her Nurse Death. This includes when they are standing in line at the canteen, and that when the nursing manager put to one of the consultants, that he was pushing her too far, and what if she went home and committed suicide, and what would happen to her elderly parents? His response to that had been, I don't care. She filed a grievance complaint, which was found in her favour. The doctor who carried out the grievance complaint said that he believed the consultants had lied. This was during the time that she had been removed from the ward for 1 year into a desk job which she hated, As she was about to return, she heard the consultants had threatened to call the police if she did so. And then finally, as she was due to return to the unit, she was suspended. For the next 2 years, she's in limbo, despite having been previously cleared by earlier investigations. She is given some emotional support by Catherine de Beja, who is the occupational therapist. Catherine de Beja has spoken quite movingly and with some loyalty, I suspect, or at least decency, about Lucy Letby. And she states repeatedly that Lucy would often be extremely upset around the deaths of the babies, and especially around the anniversaries of their deaths. This included often being very upset for the parents, apparently, as well. Karen Rees said that she couldn't believe somebody would keep up an act so convincingly for so long. She was so distressed every time she saw her. Lucy does say that she was prevented from seeing some members of staff. She put up this really quite harrowing Facebook post at the end of 2017 saying that she was not the person she was before. In police interviews, she explained that these notes were just absolute desperation, an impulse to mortally self-harm, as well as self-doubt and guilt, survivor guilt. I've seen a huge number of nurses, midwives, etc. express similar sentiments, that they have felt terrible guilt after a fatality, and especially when she'd only been practicing for a few years. Although she had been there a couple of years when this spike began. And the spike did not take long to follow after the unit was raised to a level 2. It correlates with that an awful lot closer than it does with her beginning work there. There were no searches for methods of killing. There was nothing else suspicious. He does mention the handover notes, which absolutely, it would appear that she should not have brought those home. She does strike me as very obsessive and particular, and I also suspect she was called quite often outside of work to get details again on what had happened with a particular baby. So aside from accidental bringing home of these notes, which are often, people often say medical records. Well, you couldn't accidentally bring home medical records. These were handover notes. They are often scrawled on the back of a different piece of paper, waste paper. They are not records. But yeah, she was called outside of work, so maybe that's why. Also, perhaps she was trying to work out what had gone wrong for these babies. And I have heard more than one nurse say that they're actually advised to bring their notes home as part of their studies, and she was still studying. The only thing I have to say about the note itself, apart from the obvious desperation and disorder that it screams, is the incriminating bits are in capitals. Let's have a little look at that, because they are. The rest is in cursive. On the left-hand side, you have ordered lines, as messy and distraught as they clearly are. And then on the right and at the bottom, you have what I would describe as external feelings or sentiments. These feel like intrusive thoughts to me. They are bursting into her psyche. She's a very distressed woman who's written something really heartbreaking, and at times she's gone into a stream of consciousness where I am evil, I did this, look how differently it's written. And of course, don't forget at the top it says, why me? I've done nothing wrong. Slander, discrimination, victimisation. This is not a confession, guys. I think I can't believe anybody honestly believes that. It seems so willfully blinkered to me. And finally, back to Christopher's fucking dirge. She was standing passively in front of a dying baby. Well, you can back Jairam if you want. I won't. I don't think history will look well on his legacy in this regard. And then he draws this paragraph to a close with unexplained deaths and collapses ceased when she left. Now, anybody... he really rates Crime Scene to Courtroom and the Daily Mail podcast. And on this occasion, I would suggest that people judge the quality of something by its fans. It's really not very good, is it? He is willfully obtuse, or just so dense, so entrenched in his point of view that little bits of information like, well, yes, and they knew the deaths and collapses were going to plummet, and that in fact the lawyers for the Countess of Chester advised them, don't be silly, don't get confused, you are downgrading exactly at the time you remove her, and when that drop in fatalities happens, don't conflate the two. This is important. But again, I suspect this is all they have now. And he routinely, even now, repeats this line that the babies stop dying. And he likes to dismiss the downgrading as not that relevant because most of the babies would have been there whether it was a level 1 or 2. And that is due to the complete, wholesale, absolute, I don't want to swear, studiously ignorant, dogmatic, willfully obtuse morons, condescending, aggressive, snide, stupid people have decided that the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 unit is simply between gestation and weight, refusing to acknowledge that a level 2 provides intensive care, a level 1 does not. TPM bags, invasive breathing apparatus is a level 2. God, Christ above. Anyway, I will leave you with some amusing images of people ridiculing the inclusion of Jeff Chase as an expert voice when these people have decided that a biochemical engineer is just a grease monkey. It is intractable stupidity, willful, intractable stupidity. Yeah, sorry, I have rambled ridiculously here and I will bring it to a close. So I really look forward to some more debates with people like David Davies or Peter Hitchens or something. I really quite enjoy them, but maybe take your blood pressure pills first, Chris. All right, see you later. Bye bye.